All right, hello everyone here in person and hello everyone on Zoom and welcome to today's lecture. So I just want to provide a brief moment of context for why we're hosting this talk. So I'm Krista, I'm the Education Outreach Manager from the Shaker Historical Society. And over here we have Brianna, the Executive Director. So our interest in coming up with this talk and working with Dr. Ranum came from our ongoing work with the city of Shaker Heights and the Warrensville West Cemetery across the street. So if you all don't know, right across the street, kind of in front of Heinen's and behind all of those big bushes, evergreen bushes, there is a cemetery. And that cemetery dates back to the early 1800s. And is a key part of our community, and we are personally interested as staff in wanting to learn more about American death culture and how the Shakers are a part of that or not a part of it. So that's why we were so excited to collaborate with you for this talk. So just to introduce our speaker, Katherine Ranum holds a Ph.D. in history from the University of Cincinnati. She specializes in Protestantism, Judaism, and the folk culture, or in the folk region in the British Atlantic, researches ideas of embodiment, including gender, disability, and recently death, mourning, and burial. Dr. Ranum lives in Cincinnati, but is visiting with us today in person in Shaker Heights, and teaches at both the University of Cincinnati and Xavier University. So now I'm going to I am going to share the screen with the presentation. And the floor over to Katie.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Krista and Brianna, for inviting me to come up and speak. I have been up to Cleveland before, but I have not spent time in Shaker Heights. So this was a really great opportunity for me to get to see a whole new part of the state and a beautiful part of the state. You can always tell that somewhere is beautiful if in the middle of March with standing water, it is still beautiful. So top marks, Shaker Heights, you get a full approval from me. I want to welcome everyone on Zoom as well. It's so exciting to have people in the room, but also to see names that I recognize and don't recognize on Zoom. And I want to say for everybody here and joining us digitally, that I know that people have different levels of sightedness. And so I'm going to be very deliberate in describing all of my images for everybody so that there's a clear idea of what's going on. So as Krista said, I specialize in issues pertaining to religion, particularly Protestantism and Judaism, and then folk practices of religion, and mostly in the British Atlantic world, so the Caribbean, North America, and England, and sometimes continental Europe. And in that capacity, I have studied Shakers, but mostly to teach things like transatlantic religious history. And this was a huge opportunity for me to learn more about them and to go beyond the surface. So this was really exciting for me as both a student and an educator to get more in depth on this very interesting and a creative group of Christians. All right, let's see how many things I can do at once. Chew gum and teach about death and mourning. Okay. So another point about me is that I come from a long line of both Protestant ministers and college Bible professors. So since this is a Sunday, this is going to be a 3-point sermon. There are 3 points, and they are as follows. First of all, I want to talk about studying the history of death, burial, and mourning, because it is a very particular sub-discipline in history or sociology. And so it has its own structures, but also its own pitfalls. And in relationship to that, we also have some of our own cultural pitfalls. A friend of mine said to me last weekend when he saw what I was talking on, hi, Jerry, if you're here, and I'm sorry for talking about you. He said, oh, Katie, I saw what you're going to talk about at the Shaker Historical Society. Why do you study such morbid things? I said, Jerry, death isn't morbid. But he was correct in calling out the fact that in sort of mainstream white American culture, postmodern culture, we have a very death phobic relationship, both to bodies themselves and to the practices around death and mourning. So most of us, unless we belong to maybe a subgroup like Orthodox or conservative Jews or the Church of Latter-day Saints, it's very unlikely that we are going to be involved intimately with the care and deposition of a deceased human body. So I want to talk about the study of death and maybe the pitfalls of that. Secondly, I want to talk about the Shakers in the context of their Victorian neighbors. And I will say in regards to this, I thought, well, this will be super easy, just knock it right out of the park. The Shakers are the anti-Victorians. And in a lot of ways that is true. But there was one way specifically around theologies and cultures of death, I was very surprised to see a very intensely shared phenomenon that I'm going to talk about that really disrupted what I thought I was going to see when it came to the Shakers and the Victorians and death culture. And then lastly, for me, to be honest, studying history is an ethical pursuit. It isn't just an academic one. And so I want to ask the question, since this is in the context of talking about the New Orleansville Cemetery and its place in your community, I want to talk about how should we relate to historic cemeteries in our midst? What does it mean to be modern people who are living in some kind of community with our ancestors? That isn't even really a word that we use kind of in my corner of American culture, but it makes sense. This is a community that is named after its ancestors. They are right across the street. How do we relate to them? What's the appropriate kind of relationship that we can have as the living community with the community of the deceased? So let me move to my first slide here. Good old Twitter has provided me with a wonderful example here of one of the pitfalls of studying death and mourning. So I'm going to read this and I'm going to describe it. So someone named Ultra Facts has posted this very interesting piece of modern 21st century death culture. It says, QR codes have been popping up in cemeteries. When you scan a code on a gravestone, you can read an obituary and see photos of the deceased. And then in the image, there's some pictures of these QR codes and someone using their smartphone to read the data on there. On the other side, a very cheeky beggar who's called themselves Rite of Swing says the following: 2,000 years later, the strange glyphs appearing on gravestones from the early 21st century onward remain a mystery. These astoundingly complex patterns, and no two are exactly the same, have been found on many other 21st century artifacts and are believed to have religious significance. Recovered images suggest that they were probably sacred, ooh, this hits home, to the ancient North American god Apple. It's a good crowd. And were meant to ensure that the departed would continue to be financially successful in the afterlife. In response to that, a human calling themselves Bedlam's Bard responds, as an archaeologist, I can confirm that's pretty much exactly what will happen in the future. Why did I read you this silly thing? It is because, and I have to remember this all the time and kind of check myself. When things come up in graves and in death and mourning culture, there are often things where there aren't documents. In material culture, there are not corresponding documents that say, I, Ted, did this for the following reasons, okay? And the farther we get away from the culture at which we are looking, the more mystery there is. And it's a real temptation to, like Rite of Swing, say, oh my gosh, this must have mythical, religious significance, when oftentimes, and sometimes that is definitely the case, but oftentimes there's a much more practical purpose, or simply something where we have to say, we don't know what's going on. So it's easy in the gaps in our knowledge sometimes to go for like a big swing for the fences when we need to rein in our thinking and look at the context a little bit more. And this, I think, especially happens around death and mourning, not just because of the material nature of it, but also because of the emotion and the meaning that we assign to living bodies and to the bodies of the deceased. An academic named Thomas Laqueur wrote a very, very large book called The Cultural Work of the Dead that I like to bring in and show my undergrads that we're going to read from and just watch their terrified faces. Then you give them a short assignment out of it. He wrote an entire book about the place that the dead fulfill in the life of living communities. I'm going to read a brief excerpt from that. He says, "The dead are not refuse like the other debris of life. They cannot be left for beasts to scavenge. We need to live with them more or less in close proximity." Cemeteries right across the street. "They define generations, demark the sacred and the profane and more ordinary places as well, are the guarantors of land and power and authority, mirror the living to themselves, and insist on our temporal limits. The dead make social worlds." The Cultural Work of the Dead by Thomas Laqueur. There are 2 U's in Laqueur, Laqueur. It's fascinating. It's worth the 2,000 pages. So what is Laqueur saying here? He's saying that the way a community treats its dead's members is a very clear lens for understanding who those people are and what they value, what they're afraid of, what pressures they're experiencing, and their aspirations, including their beliefs about what happens after we die. A modern example of this would be the way a community relates to a very specific dead body. For example, the Boston Marathon bomber. I had a student in my class in the fall when I was teaching a history of North American death and dying who was from Boston, and he told me this is absolutely true, that when this gentleman's body had been released by the coroner, no cemetery in Boston would take him, and there was almost a riot assaulting the coroner's van that contained his remains because Bostonians were so insistent that he would not be laid at rest in their city. And in fact, he was not. He had to be laid to rest in a plot outside the city where a private cemetery owner donated a space for him. On the contrary, when our first president, George Washington, passed away, there was competition over who was going to have possession of his remains. The federal government wanted to bury him in the Capitol and give legitimacy to the new Capitol. The government of Virginia wanted his body near their government seat to give legitimacy to them. The Masons joined in. He was a Mason. They wanted control. In George Washington's case, fortunately for him, possession was 9/10 of the law, and he was already at Mount Vernon. His wife and nephew were the custodians of his will, and he did, in fact, remain there. But it was very important where his body would go, because that would shape the power centers of the young republic. So when we study death, and when we look into the cemetery, both here that is in New Orleansville and the now defunct and divided cemetery of North Union, what we need to know in order to gain data and knowledge from the evidence that we have at hand is that all communities establish norms when it comes to burial. And what's important to remember is that within that, there's room for variation. Some communities will be more rigid than others, but there's always variation. I'm going to talk about some of the varieties of Shaker cemeteries and burial customs because I do find some flex in there inside of this very regimented, regulated community. Now, if something is completely outside the norm, and we're not going to get into this much, but just for your knowledge, there's a whole field of study on those types of burials, and they're called deviant burials because they deviate from the norm. Now, it's important to note that in English, that word deviant has a really strong connotation to it. And so sometimes English-speaking historians and archaeologists will fall into a trap that when they have a deviant burial, we automatically assign a negative connotation to that person and what happened to them, which is not always the case. But you have norms, got some little wiggly flex room in the middle, then you have far outside the norm, which is known as a deviant burial. But let's look at the Shakers here, because this is actually a place where actually, this is not the Shakers right here, this is someone else. When I was first talking to Krista and Brianna, they were telling me about the North Union Cemetery. They were telling me that the Shakers there were buried under extremely simple markers. And these markers, in most cases, or almost all cases, not all cases, had just the initials of the departed person, and then possibly their age and birth and death dates. And my brain, before I knew anything else about this set of customs, and even knowing something about the Shakers, went to this place right here. This is a photograph by a New York Times, a photographic journalist named Angel Franco. And this is Willard Asylum Cemetery, which has only kind of recently been recovered from the brambles and the brush. And it was in operation during the bulk of the 19th century. And all of the people, there are over 5,000 people who are, I think there's someone at the door, who are interred there that are only marked with numbers in these square metal, markers. In the case of many of these hospital cemeteries from this period, especially if it's hospitals for mental illness, people are only marked with numbers because mental illness was such a stigma that they were both protecting the patients from eternally being associated with this hospital, and they were also protecting their family members from the stigma of their family's name being associated with this hospital. So I'm going to demonstrate here that we have two different phenomena happening. We have two different scenarios in which we have very simplified stones or markers with very little data, but for vastly different reasons. It is not at all true that the Shakers, despite their simplicity, either had little care for the bodies of their deceased, little thought about their deceased, or little theology about death. The opposite is true. We're going to see this also in comparison to the Victorians, their contemporaries, that they too had elaborate theologies of the afterlife, but their practices, despite sharing some values, widely varied from the way the Shakers practiced death. So here we have one of the only photographs of the North Union Cemetery. This is the location where the remains of the people that are now moved to their secondary burial location across the road at Warrensville there's kind of a boulder with a plaque on there that is commemorating the Shakers. This is their primary burial location, and it's kind of a grainy black and white photograph. It was in a kind of an orchard grove, and you can see a number of square upright standing stones that there are also examples across the road. There are two remaining stones, Brianna, that were transferred over there that have the very simple engraved initials. So this simplicity, this confusing simplicity that without knowing enough made me wonder, okay, what is the Shaker theology and belief around death? For one thing, they deviated from about 2,000 years of Christian theology around the resurrection of the body. Mother Anley was very clear on this, that the actual material remains of the human body would not be raised at resurrection day, at judgment day, or the second coming of Christ. That did not mean that there wouldn't be any of those things and that there was not an afterlife of the spirit. It's just that the body took such a distant second place to the spirit. That was the point. But this is a deviation from 2,000 years of Christian theology. In fact, during the age of scholasticism, Christian theologians debated if a Christian martyr is eaten by two different lions and their bodies are digested by these two different animals, and then they go off in the woods and the remains of the humans are spread, what's going to happen on resurrection day? And they debated this down to this extreme degree, and they concluded that the Lord in his power can resurrect even that body. But the point was, the body did need to be reconstituted to participate in resurrection. So Christian bodies have had laws governing the protection of the body being intact in death for a very long time. And really it was up until Vatican II in 1963, which finally allowed Catholics to participate in cremation under certain circumstances. But there's still a favoring of having the funeral ceremony while the body is still intact. And really you can't do it for just any reason. Vatican II gives specific reasons why you can pursue cremation, including extreme times of extremity like the COVID-19 epidemic. So let me read to you now very briefly, because I mentioned that the Shakers themselves were very orderly, very regimented in all parts of their lives. And the rules that they have laid out, orders concerning death, which is section 17 in their millennial laws, has 6 points governing how a burial and a funeral ought to go. And I'm going to read this point because as a historian, I try to let the actual voices of the subjects in wherever I can and not just speak for them. So I'm going to read 4 of the points and then summarize the last 2. Number 1, when the spirit is departing and a person is breathing the last, all present should kneel in prayer. Number 2, in an hour after the breath has left the body, the corpse may be laid out in fear of God. 3, a corpse should be dressed in a shirt and a winding sheet. Now this is Katie speaking. A shirt kind of operated as the undergarment. You may have seen men's outfits. Often the shirt came down almost to the ankles and then would be tucked into pants. And that was also a sleeping garment. And a winding sheet, we might more commonly refer to that as a shroud. So we say a corpse should be dressed in a shirt and a winding sheet, a handkerchief, and a muffler. Now this is Katie again. When they disinterred the Shakers at North Union, some of the people that witnessed this said that they also wore men's white bow ties. So we might see a variation here on the muffler. The North Union community, it sounds like, favored a slightly different piece of sartorial dress. And then if necessary, so the muffler if necessary. And for a female, add thereunto a cap and a collar. 4, the laying out, dressing, and burial of a corpse is the duty of the deacons and deaconesses to direct, and the elders may not take any part therein unless necessity require. It is their duty to lead and direct the funeral. And then points number 5 and 6, so there are not a lot of points here, are all about children under the age of 12 should not attend any of these things unless there's a real special dispensation given, like a particularly close relationship between the deceased and the young person. But mostly children in their community groups were kept separate from this. So we're establishing the norms here, right? For burial, very simple, pine coffin, uniform dress for women and for men, simple, simple, simple. The funeral, also very simple and looks much like Shaker religious services. There would often be an appropriate hymn, so group singing, short eulogy by elders or deacons, and then maybe even people who were emotionally close to them in the community. Probably looks very familiar, even to things we're familiar with. And then men and women who had entered the worship space through their separate doors would leave through separate doors and stay in their lines, gender separate lines, escorting the coffin to the funeral. Now, or to the cemetery, excuse me, the burying ground. Now here, I have now moved to a slide of Whitewater Shaker Cemetery, which is in Harrison, Ohio, about 18 miles from where I live. It is a completely closed up community, and this is the cemetery there. And I was able to confirm, walking around, speaking into my phone like I was in a film, that yes, the Shakers here were buried in the norm, which is chronological order. First person to be deceased went in the ground in the right hand corner if you're facing the back with your back to the street. And in order by death, they were laid out right to left. That's most cemeteries. Most cemeteries like this one, although I found variation inside this cemetery as well, use that simple headstone pattern. Initials, maybe a name, especially for elders and eldresses, age, and dates. As Otis Sawyer of Sabbath Day Lake, Maine said, virtues are more enduring than granite. And then afterwards, after the funeral and everything, a publication like the Shaker Manifesto would often run a short announcement of the passing of one of their members and even run a portrait of the person who passed. And in fact, in a couple of periods, they had to have a completely different publication that only had the death announcements and portraits because death rates had gotten very high at that time. But as I said, so we've established some norms now. But this is not the only way. There were some variations in between, and the North Union Cemetery was one of them. So in the laying out, embalming came to the United States as a practice in the 1830s. It was sort of recovered as a scientific and cultural practice by a French scientist in the late 1830s. He published about it, I believe his name was Gamel. And when it came to the United States, it became more and more popular, especially with the advent of the American Civil War. More and more people were pursuing embalming, especially if their bodies, imagine a Civil War soldier needing to travel home to be buried. It came into use. In fact, Abraham Lincoln had one of his sons embalmed. But Shakers were pretty opposed to this as a group. In fact, I only found one Shaker who requested and received embalming. Her name was Aurelia Mace. But a lot of other Shakers were so opposed to this that they didn't even want the marking stones. There was one gentleman who suggested that they should use the cemeteries not only for like beautiful trees and shrubs so that the living community could come there and contemplate, but even they should plant crops there. That it should feed the community in a real way and not just a figurative way. Here is a really significant outlier. This is from the Harvard community. This is now known kind of affectionately as the Lollipop Cemetery. They had those stones, the very simplified stones, but in the 1870s, as some of them were kind of deteriorating and getting knocked around, this community elected to have metal signs, and you can see full names printed out here, dates and ages, and they are this beautiful, identical, rounded but also scalloped grave marker that is elevated on a stick like a lollipop. This is the only Shaker cemetery to have this, and their website is beautiful. They have a lot of information about how and why and what company did this work. So we have an outlier. These are not deviant burials, but it's a variation from the norm. In Whitewater, where I was making that serious face in my blue jacket here, I also found some variations. I found some Victorian gravestone imagery creeping in amongst the uniformity. I found a scroll shape on one of the stones, which was very common, signifying the beginning and then the end of life, like the book of life in Judeo-Christian kind of language. And it's a few with even more language on the stones. Interestingly, I was consulting with the ladies before the talk, and when we went across the street to see the cemetery here, often this was because a child who had not covenanted with a Shaker wanted more for their parents. And those stones often say, put here by her daughter for her beloved mother. The Victorianism creeping in. And actually, I will say this made me like the Shakers even more because it seems like there's room on the edges of this community. That even for members, people who are not full members, there's room for the values of these families to also speak in Shaker spaces. Lastly, North Union Cemetery is a little bit different from the other Shaker cemeteries in that instead of going in this counterclockwise fashion, first to depart to last to depart, men and women, as in their religious worship spaces, were segregated, men on one side and women on the other. Another variation in this pattern, this very established pattern. Actually, let me correct myself. This is not my last point, but I'm going to come back to my point in the variation about Shakers because this is where I found the really surprising overlap with their much more extravagant mainline and evangelical Protestant neighbors. So let me come back to the era of manifestations, stroke Mother Anne's work. And let's briefly talk about who these neighbors are that have such different practices from them so that we can see how astonishing this moment of overlap actually is. Victorianism was a transatlantic movement. It really marks all of the British Empire. It, of course, is named after Queen Victoria, who came to the throne in 1837. Her coronation was the next year in 38. And then she passed away in 1901. Now, a lot of historians, particularly the ones who look at death and mourning, actually will stretch the Victorian period until the phenomenon of mourning after the First World War and the Spanish flu. These traditions continue into that period, and it's once the massive trauma of those losses pass, or kind of the first and second stages of that grief passes, that we actually see a transition in the real way that people are practicing death and funerals. So for my purposes, 1830s to the 1920s really shapes this cultural phenomenon of Victorianism. Now, Victorianism becomes increasingly elaborate as it approaches the 1870s, 80s, and 90s. It starts to go into a decline around the turn of the century. And this is an increase in sentimentality, both in spoken and written words, in images around family life and death, portraits, funerals, flowers, poetry, visitations for the deceased, processions to the cemetery, and of course, the more money you had, this is also a moment of the rise of the middle class. So the more money you had, the more you want to demonstrate it at weddings and funerals. Okay. So this is going to be an increasing show of wealth by the middle and upper class Victorians. So we are speaking mostly, though not exclusively, about white Protestants. This does spread out into other segments of society as well. But here I have two examples of like the peak of Victorianism. On my left, I have Dexter Mausoleum. This is from Spring Grove Cemetery in Cincinnati. It was built in the 1870s and is a mini, and I use that word loosely, mini Gothic cathedral. Flying buttresses and all. Stained glass, a portico. There are 20 people, most of them named Dexter, in this mausoleum. And it is, I mean, the height of ornate Baroque Victorianism. On the other side of my slide, I have the most reproduced piece of Victorian death art, which is called the Angel of Grief. This is the original version of the stone that is in Rome. It was carved by sculptor William Wetmore Story for his wife who died when they were overseas. And you can now see this exact image replicated over and over again in Victorian cemeteries around the world. For those of you who are on Zoom and who maybe are hearing forward rather than sight forward, imagine kind of a square pedestal with the figure, and so this is three-dimensional, of a young female angel leaning over the top with her forehead resting on her forearms as if her teacher has just announced a pop quiz, for which she has not read the homework assignment. Large, luscious feathered wings, curled hair. This is ideal white Victorian feminine beauty and grief persona. The Victorians were also well known for continuing and heightening pre-existing death and mourning practices like hair cutting, hair jewelry, death portraits, which I think have really re-entered the modern American knowledge and imagination through Gothic horror films like The Others. But the Victorians had a very elaborate idea, both a secular and religious idea, of being emotionally connected to their dead community members. And they practiced through remembering, through visiting, through memorializing this ongoing emotional connection to their deceased. And this, my friends, is where these two movements overlap. Spiritualism. Shaker practices, in fact, predate the date most historians give for the phenomenon of spiritualism is 1848, when the Fox sisters, Kate and Maggie, began tricking their family members by cracking their toe and ankle knuckles and saying that it was a figure named Mr. Scratch living in their house and talking to them. They made quite a lot of money, and I think eventually lost quite a lot of money, tricking audiences that they were speaking to the dead. But the Shaker practices of speaking to deceased members predate them by almost a decade, starting with the era of manifestations in 1837. So Shakers had believed since Mother Ann Lee's time that the living could receive messages from the dead of many varieties of dead people, and that they themselves, by leading a virtuous life, could lead dead family members into salvation by being an example for the dead, observing them from the afterlife. So there's a two-way road of communication here. I'm just gonna check and see which slide I want to be on right here. Let's just hang out there for a moment. In 1837, a number of young women in Shaker communities began to say that they were having visions, that they were communicating both with dead members of the first kind of founding generation of Shakers, angels, Native Americans. This comes up in all kinds of like American mysticism, saying that you're talking to Native Americans. That's a whole other lecture. Famous classic Roman statesmen and other historical figures like Napoleon, Tecumseh, and others. And as this comes to be known by the worldly people, by non-Shakers, these people start coming in to observe. And the young women, it was not only women, but it was about 2/3 women who called themselves instruments and were having these visions. Women would give messages and even gifts from the deceased community to the living community. And these gifts were invisible and often very elaborate and were things that no living Shaker would own. These were gold rings, gold breastplates, tunics covered in jewels and pearls that then that Shaker who had received the gift could wear into the afterlife to be recognized. There's even a story of a gentleman receiving a trumpet that he then mimed playing for the community. So people would even keep track in little notebooks of what gifts they had received through these instruments from their dead family members. Historian Suzanne R. Thurman, who wrote "Oh Sisters, Ain't You Happy? Gender, Family, and Community" among the Harvard and Shirley Shakers, says that the line between the living and the dead had always been blurry for the Shakers. And I'm going to quote her now. She said, "Death was often tragic, but when the deceased was a promising young Shaker or a revered first believer, both the community's past and the collective memory of the elderly and its future were threatened. Shaker society was in transition, moving from a period in which its history and identity were rooted in direct contact with Ann Lee and the struggle for survival to an unknown future devoid of personal connections to its founder and the commitment of early believers. By suspending the limits of time and establishing connections with the spirits of the recently departed, the believers created an eternal now, which she also describes as a liminal space." So for Shakers in this moment of stress, when they're first, like the fight over George Washington's body, right, as the founding fathers are passing away, that link to the first movement, the people had the first visions and carry the history and weight of the community as they're leaving and you can't resource them anymore. This is a crisis for every community. And the way that the Shakers responded was with this period of visions in which the link was not severed, it was still happening, and the community still being created in this eternal now. Some modern Protestant theologians call this the now and the not yet, this sort of tension of the future and the present overlapping and living together. We can argue that spiritualism is probably playing the same role for the larger Victorian world. This is both the height of empire for the British Empire and moments of great tension as colonies are breaking away, as people are migrating in and out of the empire. There are pressures on who is a citizen and who isn't. And of course, the two great mass death events of the American Civil War and then the global First World War. Spiritualism was so widespread, both between and during these big waves, that it had adherents both religious and atheist in North America, the Caribbean, Europe, South America, and all the way into Russia. It was practiced across racial, class, and religious lines. And a difference here is that the Victorians often practiced this either in private homes with guests invited as private guests into your home, or in entertainment spaces like theaters, and there would be a fee at the door. Shakers, on the other hand, linked this so closely to their religious and community life and practice. This was practiced almost exclusively in either worship spaces or around the bedside of someone who was about to die or who had recently died. So even when outsiders came in to observe, and the Shakers often had people come in and observe, this was never for money for them, and it lacked the sort of entertainment value or even the sort of conversion evangelism portion that some other spiritualists used, either genuinely or to fill their pocket. So this increasingly demonstrated the connection between the living and the deceased members of the community. So let me read you a description of one of these events, one of these manifestations that happened at the funeral of the very last of the Harvard community Covenanters, a man named Abijah Worcester, when he passed away. So again, I want to step out of the way as the historian and let the Shakers speak for themselves. An inspired Shaker girl stood at the door to take down the names of those friends from the spirit world who were expected to attend the body to the grave in honor of Father Abijah. This girl said that there were all the first Shakers present. Father Abijah was very gratified in seeing his old friends. He's dead at this point, by the way. The old man adjusted the head in the coffin and asked Mother Ann if she thought he, being Father Abijah, had changed much. She answered no. Abijah looks well. These questions were always asked and answered by the visionist, and in this case, we know it was a young girl. We are told that Father Abijah marched out at the head of the coffin, his own coffin, singing a beautiful freedom song. The pall bearers were the eternal Father and the eternal Mother. These are the God figures in Shakerism. Christ and Mother Ann. The brethren marched out of the house from one door and the sisters from another, preceded by the elders, falling back a distance from the body to give room for the heavenly guests. The spirits lingered around the grave till their brethren of earth left the yard. Then power and wisdom, these are capitalized names, Christ and Mother struck up a lively dance when all the spirits joined hands and danced right merrily around the grave. At the close of the dance, the Godhead crossed hands, forming a seat for Father Abijah, and giving a glad shout, spread their wings and ascended, followed by the heavenly host to Mother's mansion, where a banquet was in waiting to welcome the last of the first fathers in Harvard to his final home. So we have here a beautiful illustration of this eternal now as imagined and expressed by the Shakers. The deities and the deceased community coming, participating in the funeral and accompanying their beloved brother with them to his home. This is celebratory, it's mythical, it's mystical, and it creates this liminal space where for a while, again, the living and the deceased communities are in community with each other. So what's important to note here? What is important is that this is a significant overlap in beliefs between the Victorians and the anti-Victorians. This is two different theologies and cultures, living community cultures that somehow result in a very similar overlap in spiritual practice. This is a real kick in the knees for me, who first thought of the Willard Cemetery when I heard about how the Shakers buried their own dead. So lastly, what do we do and how do we relate to our own deceased ancestors and living in proximity to something like the Warrensville Cemetery? So I've moved to a slide here that shows has marked out the plats where the old North Union Shaker Cemetery was. And we can see now that it backs up to a road, and there are two private homes that are occupying this, this property. This is going to be significant to a couple of things that I'm going to say. So first of all, I'll address this here in a minute. First of all, if we want to contemplate as very death-phobic modern Americans, how we relate to our dead neighbors, the first thing we need to know is that we shouldn't jump to conclusions or impose our own cultural beliefs on what we view, what we observe about what they have done. I demonstrated that with the Warrensville Asylum Cemetery. Number two, I think that we should know exactly what it means when we move a historic cemetery. What actually happens? So this piece of property here that's outlined in this modern kind of Google Maps view is where the cemetery used to be, North Union Shaker Cemetery, and most of the human remains have been disinterred and moved to a mass grave here in Warrensville. That is very common with historic remains. A cemetery that I've been studying for several years in Cincinnati that is now defunct, is no longer in use, it's now a park. They have to keep moving people who used to reside there in eternal rest to Spring Grove Cemetery. And there is a marker that is very similar to the one that's across the road that says, here lie some members of the former Episcopal burying ground. The reason I say almost everyone is that Kevin Pape, who is the director of Gray and Pape, which is a cultural resource management firm which works in Cincinnati, has said to me very explicitly, everyone is not moved. And when you deal with historic remains, all of the remains are almost never moved. We don't actually want to know about it, is what he told me. We want someone else to take care of it, and we don't want to know about it. So what often happens is that in just the places where building is going to happen, so for example, the homes that are on this property is where people will observe and then disinter and move human remains. What often happens in a case where coffins have disintegrated, these old pine coffins don't last very long, they're meant to. What cemetery managers often do is they collect the large bones and not the small ones. And so pieces always remain behind. So it's important for us to know that when we perform moves like this, that often we are separating human remains and we are leaving people behind. There almost certainly remains here. It's important to know, and this move to Warrensville Cemetery happened in 1908. I actually called the coroner's office here in Cuyahoga County and asked about their records about the move, and they weren't able to help me. It was only one phone call. I don't know what would happen if I spent a little bit more time on that. But the coroner's office is usually the group that gets involved with the recovery of any human remains. But once they determine that they are historic, meaning 100 years old or older, the legal status of those remains change. And therefore, the rules governing how you transport them and move them and mark them changes as well. So I think it's important for us to know this about our neighbors and about how our actions influence what happens to their bones. 3, when remains are moved to a new context, completely divorced from the one in which they were originally interred, well, what do we do then? So for example, there are no names marked on the burying ground in Warrensville, and there are only 2 of the original stones there, and simply the group name, some of the Shakers from the North cemetery. So I'm going to admit to you that I have more questions than answers. When it comes to this, I'm a big believer in signage, in things that can tell you information about the location, about the original context, can maybe give you imagery of the original context so that you can know something more about who these people were. But because I still have questions, I'm gonna kind of resort to one of my favorite quotes by G.K. Chesterton, who was a 20th century Catholic essayist and novelist. He wrote the Father Brown novels, if you're familiar with them. He said that tradition, and he was specifically speaking about religious tradition, he was speaking about Catholic tradition, but I think we can yank him out of context and plant him in a new one and still find something to glean here. He said that tradition is the democracy of the dead. So I think that by knowledge and acknowledgement, and by visiting of their own context, we can be in community still, even in our death-phobic culture. In fact, I think this is a way that we can fight our own death phobia of modern American culture, is by spending time with our deceased neighbors, with people that are in fact our, if not our genetic ancestors, are our cultural and regional ancestors. So let me just invite you, obviously the people in this room are already have some level of commitment to this community. We're here in a public library. We're here in a publicly and privately funded historical society. There's already a level of engagement with your neighbors. So let me just conclude by inviting you into more. And by the study of death, we can combat sort of the sterile and fearful image that death has come to take up residence in our communities. I'm very happy to take questions. I'm very happy to take corrections if you have any of those. It has been so lovely to speak to such an attentive group. Your eye contact is always so supportive and helpful. So thank you so much. Yes, please.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much for coming up. This was fantastic. So the Shakers were celibate, is that correct?
That is correct.
Now, how frequent was that? Just like a rule, or I guess like how frequent was it that there were multiple generations in the Shakers, either because they didn't follow that rule or like full families converting or something like that?
Right. So both things did happen, although really the reports, and I was surprised in sort of the Me Too and Church Too environment we have right now, that I have not discovered people who are like outing the Shakers for violations of this. Maybe that will happen, but really the Shakers seem to have had a very good reputation for maintaining this inside of their own communities. Nothing I have ever read has suggested that there was like really nefarious behavior kind of happening under the guise of celibacy. But this became a rule very early on. Anne Lee, who got married at a very young age, not with her complete excited consent, instituted this very early. In fact, she even considered sexual relations to be the original sin. So there definitely were cases of full families converting and coming in, but sometimes this did split marriages. Sometimes in cases of like farm failure and extreme poverty, sometimes a whole family would come in and dad would split. So there are different things that happen, but for women in a time before reliable birth control, and I can be critical of like the switch to male OBGYN care, but there are also medical benefits that were happening parallel. At a time when there was only so much you could do, especially for a traumatic or prolonged birth, this was also escape for women to no longer have sexual obligations to a male partner that could result in their own injury or death. And just a lot of work, although it was work to be a Shaker. Just quantifying it, I don't know that I can quantify, but of course, this was a movement that grew and sustained almost exclusively through conversion. Very few births into the community, and that would have been a very serious violation. Is that getting to your, yeah.
Yeah, do you mind if I keep going here?
Go for it.
Okay, yeah, because the thing to me that I thought was really interesting is without that idea of lineage, it kind of explains, or I was curious then about when you were talking about that, like cultural anxiety to have it tied to the past, right?
Yes.
If your parents didn't know it, Mother Ann, then the importance of kind of preserving your brothers and sisters or whatever the reference was to the elders is there's probably like an added pressure to create like a mythos around connecting those people, right? Because it wasn't a direct genetic family lineage back to the original, right?
Yeah, you know what, that is an emphasis that I hadn't really considered, how much more it might be important when you might be cut off from your biological family, and the need to really cement without, like, for example, a marriage ceremony. This is almost a way of cementing these chosen family ties. That's really well observed. That is very interesting. You're welcome. Points for Gryffindor. Very good. Yes, please.
Couple of things. One is in your comment early in your lecture, your talk. Another individual who was notorious upon death was Bernie Madoff.
Oh,
When he
yes.
died and was cremated, there was no one to collect his remains, in spite of the fact that he had family, a wife, grandchildren, etc. No one wanted anything to do with him, and it's very difficult to find any evidence of what happened to his cremated remains because he was, for obvious reasons, so stigmatized by even his remaining family.
Wow, that is so interesting. I did not know that about him, but we know that, for example, Osama bin Laden, the care that was taken around the strategy of handling his remains, both having an imam perform a Muslim funeral service and then burying him at sea so that his body could not become a shrine. That there was kind of there were two different venues that the American military took to demystify him, but also not offend people, where that would then additionally add on maybe adherence. I've got to look up more about Bernie Madoff. Thank you.
Also, just a quick point, we can take more questions here. If people on Zoom have questions, I did pull up the chat so we can see the chat. If you want to type your questions, or we can, in a couple minutes, you all can unmute to directly ask questions.
Yeah, yes, please.
Do you have any idea why the developers moved the cemetery?
Prime real estate.
Yeah, it was prime real estate. And these ladies can remind me. Oh, can you say again? I'm sorry.
It was only 2 buildings, so why did they buy it?
That is a great question. I think it really was dollar signs.
And a question of aesthetics in the community, not
Cemetery
wanting.
is next to their mansion. Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, I think Shaker Heights was really trying to create a very specific image in those early years. And it was of like progress and new wealth. And this didn't seem to fit in. But boy, it's a lot of work and expense. But I think sometimes, I was maybe speaking off the cuff a little bit here, I don't think cemetery managers are often paid well enough for the kind of work that they do, which might also be why sometimes things have historically been left behind. But it's difficult work as well.
Also, with the Van Swearingen real estate company, I think part of it also was the question of, like, yes, aesthetics, but like they didn't even want businesses in Shaker Heights, let alone a cemetery right in the middle of a residential neighborhood. So, wow.
Yes.
One more comment,
Yeah.
a little esoteric, but you talked about the Shakers and how during the funeral service, they were interested in dissolving the barrier between life and death. Look at the Eastern Orthodox religious service tradition in its purest sense. There's a portion in the service where the rector or the priest cries out, the doors, the doors. And this was developed in the late 3rd, early 4th century. They would close the doors to anyone who was not baptized and a member of the community. And the reason for that is that not only did they want to preserve the mass for only the believers, but it was believed that during that time, the boundary between heaven and earth was dissolved, and that you were in communion with those members of the community who had died and gone before. And to further that, the earliest, many of the artwork that they put on the wall, right, the various icons were actually paintings or drawings, as they call them, of members of their community, not just the saints as we think of, but members of the community, so that when the doors were closed, you would be in communion with members of the community that had died and gone before. So it's that same sort of notion of dissolving the boundary between life and death during the Sunday worship service. And it's still practiced. In fact, the person I read recently who commented on this is a priest in Parma, not far from here.
Oh, okay.
So it's still very much a live Christian tradition within that Eastern Orthodox community.
And what I love about studying religion is you see this continuity, but the variations then tell you about what is happening around that immediate community, a community that might have ancient ties and practices. And when there's a ripple or a variation, it's like, okay, what is happening for this group that there needs to be an adjustment. Now, I would love to spend more time on the Orthodox faith because it is so comfortable with mystical thought and language
Right.
in a way that as a modern American is often a barrier for me. And Orthodoxy has maintained that.
Also influenced by, sort of Western Catholicism and Protestantism, which was influenced by Greek and Roman thought far more than the Eastern Orthodox.
Yes.
And so they embraced a far more mystical worldview than what you see in the religious traditions that have come down to us.
Is there a cathedral in Parma? Is there an Orthodox cathedral?
There may be, I don't know.
Okay,
I've
okay.
not.
Yes, there are.
Okay.
More than one. Really impressive too.
Yeah.
Are they through like Polish migration or
Yeah.
okay.
And Ukrainian, there's
And-
Ukrainian Orthodox.
Russian too.
Okay, okay. I hope not next door to each other.
Can I just ask you a question?
I
Have you ever been to Lakeview Cemetery? Since you were talking about Victorian cemetery.
Is that the one up
burials.
near Defiance?
No,
It's like
it's
Cleveland.
not too
Oh, is it
far
Cleveland?
away.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. I have not been.
It's
It's really
very,
cool.
it's a beautiful place. You just want to go there to visit as a park. It's, plus there's a very notable mausoleum that contains the remains of President Garfield and his wife.
Oh, okay.
But the Victorian cemetery monuments are unbelievable.
Well, lots of money in Cleveland during
Oh,
that
yes.
period, the
Uh-huh.
Victorian period. Yeah,
Yeah.
which leaves behind this wonderful legacy of architecture, including
Yeah,
in cemeteries, which at this moment, I didn't really go into this. This is a big break in Western European cemetery culture, the move from the churchyard into the big ecumenical park cemetery Thomas Lacour talks about this as being like an overthrow of the regime of the dead, a 2,000-year regime of the dead when this happens. And it's a new way of focusing on the living, but I've got that written down now.
they've even got a chapel that has Tiffany walls and floors.
And floors?
Yeah,
It's the only building that was totally built by Tiffany, every aspect of it.
yeah, it's
Still.
just absolutely outstanding.
You should go there
And
the
there's-
day before you leave, Cleveland.
I should.
Yeah, really, it would be
Pews are made
interesting.
from cedars from Lebanon. I mean,
Yeah.
everything is totally amazing. And John D. Rockefeller, by the way, if you want rich people, is buried in that cemetery.
Yeah.
Although his is very plain, it's a simple marker, big obelisk. He spent money, one
Right.
piece, solid marble for the whole family though. But his grave is just a simple stuff.
And if you're on a Shaker Heights kick, the Vance French are very there as well.
Oh, they
Yeah.
are.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
And they have pretty.
They
Really.
All the prominent
It just says
Protestants were buried there.
You have a comment that Spring Grove Cemetery designer also designed Lakeview.
Oh, okay. Adolphus Strauss. Yeah, Strauss.
Where is the Harvard Cemetery?
It is.
Massachusetts, I assume.
It is. I believe it is a part of or just on the edge of the very large Mount Auburn Cemetery, which I think was the first rural garden cemetery
Okay.
in the US, maybe in
Yeah.
North America. So, but it is near Harvard College. Yeah, it's very big, and there's a huge Egyptian revival entryway on that cemetery, not the Shaker portion, but the larger cemetery that I would love to see. I've only seen drawings of it, but Discovery of King Tut's tomb really kicked off a lot of imitation Egyptian stuff.
Yeah, stuff that we stole.
Well, that too, yeah. A lot of it's in the British Museum. Sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say, do any folks on Zoom have questions? Does anybody want to unmute? That's okay.
You're not obligated to. Yeah,
Were any Shakers involved with the replanting of their brothers and sisters across the street?
No, not so far as I know. I know that the community had been disbanded. But do you know, were there any living? Well, they put out a notice because I think the community had itself like disbanded. And this happened at the cemetery I was studying as well. Like, hey, we're moving people. Do you want to come get your person and move them where you want? But I don't think anyone replied.
What year did they just?
And then the removal happened in 1908. So did you know, remember more about?
Yeah, Brianna and I had found that they possibly asked like existing Shaker communities, but it's unclear if like they just said that they asked them or if they actually asked for permission. No.
Evidence,
We haven't
evidence or
found
record
anything.
that they asked, but supposedly they got permission because, as Katie was saying, that the body isn't the important part, it's the spirit and the soul.
Yeah.
But we have never seen proof of that, so I don't want to say that they in fact got permission.
Yeah, that sometimes is another area where it's a little bit like kids, like, yes, I did ask Dad if I could eat this entire pie. He said yes. Dad's in Cleveland. I'm in Cincinnati.
I mean, it seems very disrespectful to me
Yeah.
that for two lousy houses, they
Mhm.
take out this, they just say, oh, we'll just move it. Like they planned to put a lot more houses there, but that didn't happen or something. But very disrespectful. So if any cemetery over 100 years, you can do this kind of thing
No.
today?
No, so what has really changed, another thing that has really changed is that most modern cemeteries, when you buy a plot, you are buying it in perpetuity.
Yeah, you actually pay
Yes.
for that ground. I know
Yes.
that.
But 150 years ago, that was not the case. That was not the case for this cemetery. The ownership really could transfer. The 100 years thing is what I was mentioning, is that the legal status of what had been a living human being changes at the 100-year mark. Most states change the legal requirements for how you handle human bones once they hit their 100-year birthday after death. So if for example, we were talking about if the city were to do some road work right in front of the cemetery over here, almost certainly, this always happens, they might disturb some kind of human remains. What would have to happen if that occurred was that all construction would cease and the medical examiner's office would be called in. If the medical examiner's office discovered that those bones were 50 years old, they would then need to take them into the ME and do an exam to make sure that there was no like foul play. If they say, actually, these are historic remains, what happens then is, it kind of depends on what stakeholders are involved, but the remains are just kind of reinterred nearby or in an appropriate place. And that's the end of it. But
I mean, I
yeah.
found it interesting that they didn't even think that they had to, it's a mass grave. I
Yep.
mean, that's like a war situation, is throw people in a hole. I mean, the community had only disinvolved, it was only like 20 years earlier when it closed.
Right.
There could be some people who are, you would think there'd be some people who are very recent to that time.
You're right. Yeah. What I have often, mass graves that are planned versus ones that are in war zones are very different. And that word has such a negative connotation for us. But you can have a couple of versions of this where you might have a trench where people are lined up together and they're all, a mass grave means that people are touching, the remains are touching, or their container is touching. So you might have a trench where people are kind of in a line. So they're not, thrown in willy-nilly. That's a no-no, no matter how old the bones are. But then, so the individuals that I've been studying in Cincinnati that were moved to a mass grave in Spring Grove were all, after they were looked at by the medical examiner and determined to be not recent, they were labeled in very small containers, boxes like remains number 37. And then those were all put in the same. But again, they're like stacked and placed. They're not, tossed in. So a mass grave can have different meanings kind of depending on the context. And this is a question I've been thinking about what our relationship is to our dead members. Because on the one hand, if we never ever move any remains ever, that's not a democracy with the dead, that's like the autocracy of the dead. But there's certainly a way, and of course we have different values than, for example, various Indigenous and Native American communities have when it comes to this, and so different communities have different values. But is there a way that we can respectfully move? I think there is, but we have to do it, and we can't cut corners. And sadly, that is very frequently what happens, is that it's expensive and time consuming and emotional, and you want to get things done. And
Well, that's not too emotional.
Sometimes-
When you're worried about the time.
that's
I mean, when that, I'm surprised. They don't even necessarily take all the bones. Oh, we took the main ones.
this is, been found very frequently. Yeah.
That's
Big
not
fingers.
very respectful.
No, it's not. I agree.
Oh, sorry again. I was just gonna say that I think that the just completely disregard for the Shaker Cemetery is just so emblematic of like the whole of Shaker Heights, right? Like, I mean, it's a nouveau riche, like just it's the turn of the century, new rich industrial money built on top of built on top of a commune, right? I mean, it was the Shakers were religiously, or excuse me, the Shakers were racially diverse, right? They accepted all members, and Shaker Heights was notoriously segregated. They kept all the imagery of the Shakers on their signs and the Tree of Life and all that kind of nonsense, all that kind of iconography without any of the meaningful hard work that goes behind it, right? So I think that the fact that they did not preserve the cemetery is not surprising. I don't think the fact that they packed the mill with dynamite and blew it up on the 4th of July as a celebration is a surprise. It's just, I mean, it's, to me, it's on the nose. It's so on the nose that it's almost parody. You know what I mean?
You are doing the work of a historian.
Oh, well.
What were the values of the people who did that work? You have uncovered it beautifully. Yeah. So now, no one in this room can undo that. Now, there can be a new relationship to the heritage, the name, the iconography, and the bodies of the Shakers. And the people in this room are doing that work. And the conversations around what's going to happen with that cemetery, no one's putting a CVS on it, but how do we actually present it? How is it accessible to the public? How is it monitored? How can it be usable public space? How do we talk about it? That is the work that we get to do. Yeah.
Let me offer a slightly contrarian view to what's just been suggested here. And there might be a through line in terms of what the Van Swergens did with the Shaker community. The Shaker community had a vision for sort of a semi-utopian, like many of the communities in the early 19th century, antebellum South or antebellum America. The Van Swergens were also possessed of an idea that they could build something new and different, because the Garden City concept was not at all, well, in fact, it's the first one in the United States. And what they say is garden, in the United States, we call it front yard, backyard, right? So the idea of having a suburban area that was linked with a light rail system that was distinct and separate from downtown was itself an attempt to create a vision for a community that had never existed before. Because all communities before had been city-centric, right, around where you work and so forth, right? And this was the idea of saying, I can remove it so I can have a more pastoral life, and yet still through the rail system be connected. So even though it is not, they did not seek to honor the religious heritage of the Shaker, the North Union Shakers, they were honoring the spirit of innovation in terms of how do we do something different in terms of how we build community. Because It is very different than the way most people would experience city life in Cleveland, as an example, on the Millionaire Mile, or down before they built the large tower, right? Everybody was proud of these sort of tenement-like homes and so forth, right? Or very much like London, right? Where everyone's living in, right, tight. They said, no, we want to extend a new way of living. So I would argue that the Van Swearengens actually, from a through line standpoint, had that same sort of vision, or a vision for a different way of living, as did the North Union Shaker.
Maybe for your guys' next newsletter, you could have a point counterpoint.
It's interesting, they didn't not take the name. They wanted Shaker Heights because why did they want it? They must have thought it sounded cool or something. I mean, why did they keep Shaker Heights? They could have called it anything else. They owned the property.
Well, I think they very much wanted to sell that idea of a utopia.
I think
Yeah,
that was
because
utopia.
they had a lot of, I mean, they were master marketers.
Right.
So as was already, what was already referenced in terms of taking that image of the Shakers, because you think of peacefulness, the
Right.
countryside almost, you know,
Countryside, yeah.
farming, just like this simple way of living.
What about the parts
yeah.
they didn't want it, that sort of was in the way and kept what they.
Yeah, I mean,
wanted to keep?
it's interesting, you know, working at the museum, sometimes we get people who just went to other Shaker communities that still have structures standing, and they show up and they're like, well, where are your Shaker structures? And we don't have any. Like that, the reality is that they were repurposed, the buildings were torn down even prior to the Van Swearengens to be reused. They were not seen as something to be saved. But yeah, the marketing materials that were put out by the Van Swearengens are called like Peaceful Shaker Village, you know, that very much the imagery of the utopia is what they wanted. So I think the name kind of reflects that as well.
And the marketing, the Shakers, the name had been applied to other products earlier, like the seeds. Now Shakers themselves sold seeds, but there were other people, I think there was like an oatmeal company, wasn't there, that wanted, they were like, well, everybody knows Shakers mean value. The product has value. So I wouldn't be surprised if that was a part of it as well. We are building something new, and what we are creating is value for your money.
Quaker Oats.
Quaker Oats, yeah,
Leverages off the concept of a religious community.
honesty.
Silverware.
Yeah. Yes,
I have
please.
one that will shock a lot of people. It's really, this is interesting. I shouldn't say interesting, it's sad. Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the South, is still very divided. There was a section that had actually where slaves were actually sold. And there were graves of the slaves. The city of Richmond took it over and built a parking lot.
By a railroad track. Yeah.
Yeah, what happens to the remains of human beings often is related to who has power. Or I should say, always. I'm always telling my students, if you have a multiple choice, like be careful of the always and the never, but who has power? And what history do we want to aim, benefit from, struggle with? We're struggling over our public history. And I would say it is a good struggle that we're having. It's better to have a good struggle than a bad peace. And for many of our neighbors, it's been a bad peace. I'm so glad you brought that up, because that is clearly a disregard story of those people.
One other trivia question on this one. Okay. The Sedgwick family out of Boston, supposedly, because I haven't seen this, was so arrogant that the family said, we only will see each other when we go to heaven because we're the most important. So here he is in the center, and all the Sedgwick family are buried so that heaven, they only see each other because that's all that's.
You know, their graves are facing.
The graves are facing the.
Do you know, are they?
Bible? It's not a good idea.
Sedgwick family, Boston. Are they buried in Boston? Are they buried in Mount Auburn? Do you know?
I think it's.
I want to look that up because that's an incredible expression of identity, group, self-identity, group identity, afterlife values. One of the most shocking things I read in grad school to tie your two thoughts together, and now I can't think of the name of the book, was a woman who was a mistress of a slaveholding family who her slaves were being baptized, and she was very irritated, and she asked the pastor, okay, but I don't have to see them in heaven, right?
You're right, because you won't be there.
Yeah. So he said, bless your heart.
Good answer.
But this broken, yeah, theology around. Oh, my word. I've got to look that up. That's fascinating.
It could be, and it's just rumor I've heard, but supposedly.
Even as a rumor, it tells us something.
This is another country, but this I know to be true because I was there this last summer. And Hitler's bunker, where he is buried, is a parking lot. Germany made it a parking lot, so it's nothing.
And there's no signage.
There's no
or
signage,
anything.
there's nothing.
How did you find it?
Because I got the guide who tells you where it is, but I mean, there's no marker, there's no signs. They take you and say, this is where the bunker was. This is
I
where
was
he was.
actually there 2 weeks ago and I spit on the ground.
See, that's interesting. I didn't know, there's so much like a noise around his body that I didn't even know that they left him in the bunker where he committed suicide. So that's really interesting.
Well, they left him there, like.
That's what it sounds like.
Stalin wanted the teeth. So they know the teeth of Hitler are somewhere in the Kremlin. That they know, because he insisted on getting the teeth.
Yeah. They got a lot of stuff. Russians have a lot of stuff.
Well,
Yeah.
well, they were the first ones to go into Berlin, so they could take what they wanted.
Right.
So, but the Holocaust Memorial is there's one in Berlin. So quite impressive.
And when you're in the Gnalva Gallery in Berlin, because I'm an art history, and you look at the provenance to find out where it came from, so many of those fabulous, especially the Dutch galleries, no provenance listed. They were stolen and they've never gotten back to the original owners. It's so obvious.
Yeah. Museum speak or such a feisty group. And I always leave these things. Bless your heart. No. Thank you so much for that information, and I always learn so much once I finally pipe down at the end of these things. And what a great way to spend a Sunday afternoon.
Thank you.
Before we wrap up, I wanted to let you all know about one event of interest based off of our conversation, and then a couple other things the Historical Society has going on. So not next Thursday, but the following Thursday, the 23rd, we're hosting another lecture with another academic. So that one is called Shaking Your Filthy Tail, Religious Rivalry and Shaker Identity in the Early American Republic. So Dr. Hessinger is going to talk about this idea of the Shaker image and about the idea of how Shakers brought children into the Shaker community and how that was incredibly contentious with the outside world. So the Shakers were the target of many mob attacks, lots of political political activism in the early American Republic. And so Dr. Hessinger is going to talk about his research and how the Shakers changed their identity and this vision of Mother Ann Lee as a maternal figure meant to protect the Shaker children in order to try to quiet down the different attacks from the outside community. So that should be very, very interesting. That's also free. That one is going to be at the museum, not here at the library, but all the information is listed on our website. And then we also have two other more fun events coming up. So the first one is called Mingle at the Mansion. You might have seen, some of you came to the Mingle at the Mansion in February. We're hosting another one in April that's going to be botanical themed. So we're partnering with Stump, the plant shop that's based out of Van Aken district, and Chef Doug Katz to be sponsoring all of the food, but also fun activities related to plants and drinks related to plants. So yeah, so that one, tickets are on sale online. It is $25 for members or $30 for non-members. And if you are interested in becoming a Shaker Heights Historical Society member, we have membership packets over here, and Brianna and I are always happy to talk about it. One other event of interest that is just launched on our website, we are partnering with ICA Art Conservation on the west side of Cleveland to host a talk at the museum called Caring for Your Treasures. So they're going to do about a 45-minute presentation talking all about preservation and how you can preserve your own items. But then also it's going to be like a similar group discussion where you can bring an item to share the story of, to ask questions to the conservators. Yeah. So that is going to be in June. That is on June 8th, another Thursday evening at the museum.
Antiques were
Yes, kind of. Yes, Antiques Roadshow meets Shaker Historical Society. Yeah, so if you have any questions about any of those programs, or if you want to learn more about them, you can also sign up for our email list separate from membership to learn about our upcoming programs and things we have going on. So yeah, thank you everyone for coming today. Yes, and thank you everyone on Zoom.
Thank you so much. It was so interesting.
Thank you.
Fascinating.
There were